I want you to know that today we have many stock options available for you. And I was wondering if you'd like to invest. Hi, everybody. Today is the second episode of... Listen, it took me a while to get to the point and actually finish this last, but it is getting really hot in here. Listen, I get... Today we're going to be talking about having less empathy. Yup, that's right. Less empathy, meaning we're gonna learn how to be rational. So let's get started. Today's episode is about a book from, in fact, it's right in front of me, is Against Empathy by Paul Bloom. This book was essentially about finding ways to recognize how empathy is not necessarily the best option or reason as to why we should do good things. A lot of people will say things like, if we had more empathy in the world, we wouldn't do terrible things to each other. You'll see, one, why empathy is not the greatest thing in the world, and two, why there are other things we could use that give us a reason or a motivator to do good things for one another and for ourselves and for the world in general. So there were 5 things that I learned. Well, I want to start off first is that Paul Bloom uses the definition of empathy as the act of feeling what you think the others are feeling, or the act of coming to experience the world as you think someone else does. Some of the characteristics of empathy that are not so great are, 1, it's a spotlight that focuses on usually a very small number, typically one individual at that present moment. And 2 is that it causes us to care about those individuals beneath that spotlight. So anyone that's not in that spotlight or in that focus, forget it. 3rd one is that it doesn't really allow us to recognize the suffering of others who we don't empathize with. And I'll get into more details in this second lesson. But it's really one of those things that we don't really think about the other people who are suffering if we don't empathize with them. And we'll talk about that when we realize that empathy isn't just something that happens. There are a number of things that are considered before empathy ever gets employed. Another part is that empathy is biased. So that not only is empathy biased, it reflects the biases that we have and shows who we care about and who we want to focus on. Number 5 is that it compels us to take action and completely disregards any possible future results. So this is kind of like picking a quick fix for something and then having terrible results afterward. The next part is that empathy is capable of inciting violence. So if we ever see someone get hurt or that's someone we care about, we may automatically think to ourselves, I feel their pain, so now I'm gonna inflict the pain that was done to them. The next part is that empathy tends to disregard statistical data. It's very focused on a very emotional standpoint. It really tugs at our emotions and is kind of that one knee-jerk reaction that makes us do things without really thinking things through or taking a moment to see the facts or think about the facts. And lastly, under the pitfalls as to why empathy isn't so great is that we can't really empathize with more than 2 people, especially if those 2 people are going through 2 different circumstances, 2 vastly different circumstances at the same time. What Paul Bloom is trying to do is not to say that empathy needs to just... It's just trying to say that empathy needs to really be put on the back burner, and it shouldn't be the first thing or the first reason why we do good things for one another or do just things. What it's trying to say is that we should focus on how empathy makes us do things that aren't really great solutions or don't allow us to do the most good in any given situation. Once I read how many pitfalls there were to empathy, I started to realize maybe we shouldn't have more empathy because there's just such a high risk of other bad things happening, like where we just leave people out of the equation or we just reflect more biases than we have already, or that we just kind of react on a knee-jerk emotional pull rather than standing by the facts and thinking things through, right? So that was one of those things that really opened my eyes because I come from a background of mental health counseling, and a lot of the time we have to be empathic, to some degree, so that, people feel like they're being heard or being understood. But now I'm seeing that empathy probably isn't always the first option, and probably shouldn't be the first option for many problems that I face or that you may face. So the second thing I learned is that empathy is a result. There are morals, judgments, considerations, beliefs, and assumptions that we make first about a person before we ever feel empathy for that person. So one of the examples that Paul Bloom gave was about subjects in a study who were given a story about people who have AIDS. The people who had AIDS were divided into two groups. One group of people that had AIDS gotten it through intravenous drug use, and the other group of people who had AIDS had gotten it through a blood transfusion. And so they asked the subjects, which group of people do you feel empathy for? And by an overwhelming result, the people who got the most empathy were the people who had gotten AIDS through a blood transfusion. So what's terrible is that while both groups are experiencing a possibly terminal illness, granted, luckily we have treatment for it, it's one of those things that is really just messed up. Like, those people's lives are in very much grave danger to even just the simplest of diseases. And now the subjects were like, well, I feel bad for the ones because it was no fault of their own. I feel bad for the people who got it through the blood transfusion. We really take away a lot of care and concern for the people who did it to themselves. This could be not just with living with a life-threatening syndrome, but also just maybe financial struggles. If you encounter a friend who constantly complains about not having enough money, but yet you see them go on like extravagant spending sprees, or they buy a lot of by the way, this was $17. Well, it's tough to think that we would want to feel any sort of empathy for them because they did it to themselves. So even from life-threatening diseases to very mundane things, to even stuff in the middle, if they don't fit the bill, we're not going to feel empathy for them. In another study, subjects were told about a scenario where there was a line of children who were terminally ill, and they were all waiting in line to receive treatment. Now, they asked the subjects, would you want to move any of these children around so that one gets treatment sooner than the other? No, they didn't want to move any of the children around because they all equally need treatment. However, once the test subjects were introduced to a story about a little girl who was in that line, who was terminally ill, told them about her backstory, her childhood so far, it caused the test subjects to want to move her up on the line and move her forward and ahead of other terminally ill children because they heard her story. So here you can see that empathy makes us want to do things that are really illogical and unfair to other people who also are in need. So you'll see how the biases come into play, and we have this spotlight focused on people who are in need just because we heard their story. One more example was a foundation known as Habitat for Humanity was testing something when it came to their marketing campaign. And essentially, they had just changed one word in their marketing campaign, and it caused donations to skyrocket. When they marketed their campaign, if you don't know, Habitats of Humanity is a foundation that sets up shelters and living arrangements for families that are in need. And so in their marketing campaign, when they had said, quote, the family will be selected, their donations were like, they're all right, they're nothing too crazy. But when they said the family has been selected, their donations went through the roof. And now the reason why their donations went through the roof is because, again, empathy managed to play a role here. Empathy needs a target. And if there is no target, it's hard for us to feel any sort of empathy. This could be for things like, like taking care of the environment, right? There's no real target for empathy, so you'll not see very many people care about it too much. If you think about it, seriously, like, can you name how many people you know that really, really care about the environment? Like recycle, don't waste, they use like, environmentally friendly items, don't use plastic, toothbrushes, or just don't make a mess of the environment. Because I only know like a double handful of people, and that's not a lot. After reading how much bias empathy can reveal about me, I thought it would be important to recognize ways to be less biased. So third lesson is how to be less biased. Two things: Darwinian bias and attention bias. So Darwinian bias is essentially where we focus on people that are just like us, having the same sports team support or having the same political views. We're going to think of those people as one of us. And it's very hard sometimes to think or care about the people that are outside of that sphere of thought. This goes back to that whole us and them sort of mindset. Again, if they're not like us, chances are we're not going to care too much about them. That's bias. That's straight up bias. Attention bias is one of those things that we focus on what is new, trendy, or shiny. So, for example, we don't talk about MySpace anymore. It's just weird if you do. We don't talk about fidget spinners. We don't talk about the Harlem Shake anymore. That's done. Like, that's not new. That's not trending anymore. And then there's things that are trending these days. Like, for example, the right? Or literally anything Donald Trump does. or Elon Musk and Grimes' kid and naming their kid that, right? And then there's things that are currently trending or have been trending, but should continue to matter even after the trend or the hype is gone. For example, like protecting people from preventable diseases, hashtag Black Lives Matter, things like mental health stigma eradication. Like these things should not be some like hype trend that just happen for like a week and then, we fixed it, hooray. No, like these things are something we should care about. However, because we have things like attention bias, because it's not cool, hip, or happening, or trending, that we just don't care about it anymore. And a lot of the time, certain things fall off the face of the earth because people just don't talk about it anymore. It's just not, trending to talk about it. And it sucks because a lot of things tend to fall through and other things that aren't important get attention. You want to focus on ways that you can realize where your biases stand and put your effort into things that matter and putting your effort into things that are long time efforts. So things that are like, your mental health, or like advocating for people who are in need, or trying your best to donate to trustworthy foundations and causes that will work towards preventing things that are easily preventable, things like that. But a lot of the time, empathy just tends to make us focus on things that are new and shiny. And sometimes that's not the right thing to do. So the fourth lesson, and this was personally my favorite lesson in against empathy, was recognizing the use of empathy in different relationships. So the three different relationships I'll talk about are professional relationships, friendship and romantic relationships, and lastly, parental relationships. So for professional relationships, I'm going to focus primarily on the helping roles. So we're talking like doctors, nurses, and therapists, although this is also somewhat applicable in retail and customer service roles. In professional relationships, Paul Bloom mentions a particular surgeon by the name of Christine Montross, and says that in her excerpt, she says that she was listening to one of her patients who needed psychiatric help talk about her son who had died and wound up in a morgue. And Christine mentions that if she were to employ empathy, she would be incapacitated because she would then start to think about her own son winding up in a morgue. And she wouldn't be able to help that mother who is grieving over her son with her psychiatric needs. So she said to herself at the same time, and this is Christine we're talking about, if Christine wound up, let's say, being wheeled into the trauma bay because she needed emergency surgery, she doesn't want the trauma surgeon to be like, okay, well, let's sit down and talk about your problems. Christine mentions she just wants the surgeon to just get right to work and help her save her life. So in professional relationships, it can be very tough to try to be empathetic to your patients or your clients, but at the same time, not take on the pain that they're going through. There's a healthy balance of empathy. You want to have enough empathy so that the patient or the client feels like they're being heard, but you don't want to be as unempathetic that you come off as cold. The second kind of relationships are the friendships and the romantic relationships. So in certain scenarios, this one's a little bit tough to read, but it's kind of tough to read when and what you should feel when someone shares news with you. So if someone comes to you and tells you like, hey, like I got promoted, like, oh, that's great. Like, I'm really happy for you. You can be happy for them, but you don't have to empathize with their happiness. You didn't get promoted. They did, right? So if someone comes to you with bad news and they tell you like, hey, like I just lost my job. Okay, well, first of all, don't celebrate because unless they wanted to get fired, don't celebrate. But you can share in their loss, right? Paul Bloom mentions how like the benefits of friendships are very much akin to what Cicero said, which was that friendships, they double our joys and they divide our sorrows. Kind of like that. It's hard to tell like how you're supposed to act, but even in romantic relationships, it's important not to match the other person's feelings all the time. I know that you'll see this in movies very often where people will amp things up to like the highest degree of saying like, oh, like this person's my other half, or like I wouldn't live without them. You were alive before you met that person, so you don't have to. What I meant to say was, when it comes to relationships, you can always ask a person, especially if they have a problem or they're going through something, you can always ask, do you want me to listen or do you want me to give advice? For my own personal scenario, whenever I go through something, I usually just want my friends to listen or to just ask me questions just to like gauge my thinking. Most of the time, I usually know what I need to do to solve my problems, but it's just the emotional baggage that's bothering me. It's hard to say what you should do in every single scenario when it comes to your friendships or romantic relationships. More often than not, if you can share in the joys of the people that you spend time with and in some ways alleviate or just be with that person when they're going through a tough time, I'm pretty sure you'll come out all right. The third relationship that we concern ourselves with where empathy plays a role is in parenting. So first of all, I'm not a parent. Okay, I don't have kids. I have never raised a child. But what I will say is that I would imagine that most parents love their children. If they don't, when it comes to parenting, there's two things that come to mind where empathy really should not play much of a role. Let's say your kid comes up to you and says, hey, I want to stay up late. And you usually put them to bed around like 8, 9 p.m. Okay, I guess having them stay up late like every now and again to like 9:30, 10 o'clock, like, okay, sure. But if you do that for them all the time and you empathize with them and you think about the times when your parents didn't let you stay up late, or, you can always let them have it every now and again, and you may want to like let them have that freedom. Sure, that's fine. But there's a problem when you constantly let them stay up late all the time, right? Because then eventually the time that you don't want them to stay up late, they're going to fight with you. They're going to fight with you and they're not going to be too happy with you. And they're going to be like, well, you said back then that I could do this and now you don't want to let me do it. You want to keep their long-term goals in mind. So with empathy, there's this focus on trying to do the most good. What that means is that you try to keep the long-term prospects in mind, and you may have to do some short-term harm to keep the long-term goals in place. So if your kid wants to stay up late, sure, maybe like every now and again, sporadically, sure. But it's good for them to get enough sleep so that they can grow up to be strong and be healthy. Another example would be like if kids want sugary treats or they want like processed food or non-nutritious food. Sure, every now and again they can go and they can have it. But if you keep letting them have it over and over again, you're gonna ruin the goal of letting them grow up to be healthy. So it might be some short-term harm to say to your son or daughter or child, no, when they ask to stay up later, when they say they want to have a treat. They might get mad, they might throw a tantrum, but in the long run, they will have a greater health trajectory. They will grow up to be as healthy as possible because you let them sleep at a correct time with enough sleep and you let them eat healthy foods. So try to keep that in mind when it comes to empathy. You'll see here that empathy kind of makes you do some things that are like good in the short term, but they're pretty bad in the long term. I'm sure you've seen the memes where two people are like hanging out or they're having like a good time and one of the people is tagged as me and then the other person is tagged as somebody's son or somebody's daughter. Or if you've heard the song Everything I Wanted by Billie Eilish, one of the lyrics is they called me weak, like I'm not just somebody's daughter. When I hear somebody's daughter, somebody's brother, somebody's son, like it reminds me and helps me recognize that everyone around me is related to someone else in some way. When I see the people I care about get hurt, or the people that I know or the people that I love watch them get hurt, like it stirs something in me, especially if I see it happen from start to finish. And it can make me want to retaliate for them. And what happens is that this kind of ties back to what I said at the beginning, that empathy incites violence. Am I saying that violence is never the answer? Well, sometimes it is. That's just my personal opinion. Sometimes violence is the answer, especially if rules aren't being complied with. And so it's a reminder that everyone around us is related to someone or knows somebody. Now, this could even be like the most minute thing. This could be like someone else's boss, someone else's supervisor, someone else's teacher, or just someone else's coworker, right? And it could be just the smallest relationship, but I know that person. I knew that person. So when it comes to thinking about if someone of your own gets hurt or you start to think about hurting somebody else, just remember, chances are that person probably has relationships that are just as complicated as yours and just as complicated as your friends. So keep that in mind. And I think in the end, Paul Bloom really is not saying that we should get rid of empathy. It's just saying that there are probably many other reasons to do good things for one another that don't have to be based in empathy. Like, oh, I feel your pain, so I'm going to take care of you. No, I'm doing this because I care about you, or I'm going out of my way because it's the right thing to do. It doesn't have to be just because I feel your pain. I may not even actually feel your pain. I actually just want to do the right thing. I just want to do the good thing. I just want to stick to the facts just because that's the just thing to do. Overall, I think Against Empathy is a 7 out of 10. I literally haven't picked up that book since I tossed it over my shoulder. I will definitely keep this book under the heart and nerve categories due to its heavy emphasis on reframing my idea of what empathy is and what it does, and pushing for making more rational and compassionate judgments. If you guys like this book and you like the way it sounds and you want to get it for yourself, I have left an Amazon affiliate link in the description. If you want to help me out, that would be really appreciated. Otherwise, tune in next time for the next episode. Peace out.